Good afternoon.
What do you make of the fact we've got these two ex-Prime Ministers effectively saying the same kind of thing? We should listen to ex-Prime Ministers, shouldn't we?
Should we? Why? There's a very good reason why they're ex. People lost confidence in them.
Well, up to a point, but American presidents...
Quite a strong point in the case of Tony Blair, with John Major. He took us to the worst Conservative victory in the 20th century, even worse than 1906.
Well, that doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't listen to people who've done the job of Prime Minister, because only those who've done the job, I suppose, understand how difficult it is. And in America, American ex-presidents are always treated with some sort of reverence. In this country, we don't do that, and I've often wondered why.
Well, I think we have a rather healthier approach to ex-political figures than they do in America, that the awe for ex-American presidents has always seemed to me somewhat disproportionate. And they also have term limits, so you never quite know with a president who's served 8 years whether he would have won or not.
No, but if Margaret Thatcher had been speaking, I suspect you would have wanted to listen to her because she agrees with you. Now, these two ex-Prime Ministers, you clearly don't agree with them, but that doesn't invalidate their right to speak out, does it?
Of course they're entitled to speak out, but they're also entitled to be disagreed with, and I don't think that once they have left democratic politics, they have any particular right to expect their views to be accepted. And if Margaret Thatcher was still alive and spoke out, a lot of people would disagree with her strongly and would feel that her views were not their views. And I don't think people would have listened to her because she was an ex-Prime Minister. It's whether the views make any sense. It's not the post. It's the arguments that are being put forward.
Well, let's look at some of Tony Blair's arguments. He says that European leaders should show that they can reform, enabling British people to change their minds. Now, I said in my introduction that one of the reasons why I voted Leave was because the EU had shown itself on many, many occasions to be almost incapable of reform. Now, if they did show that they could reform, if they recognised the concerns about immigration, that was obviously a reason why many people voted for Brexit. If they demonstrated that they had done that, do you think that there might be a case for people giving them a second chance?
I think it's too late. I think they had that chance in David Cameron's renegotiation, and essentially they snubbed him. They showed that they weren't willing to reform. I've actually just been reading Tim Shipman's book on this, and it's very interesting that David Cameron wanted Mrs. Merkel's support, and she encouraged him to call for European reform to improve the whole EU in his Bloomberg speech. And then once he'd done that, he went along with what she suggested, gave him no help at all in the renegotiation. I don't think they deserve another chance. And if you look at other countries' experiences with referendums, like Ireland and Denmark, what has happened is they've had referendums, the EU hasn't liked the result, so they've given them a little bit of wallpaper to paper over the crack and said, oh, we've changed. And it hasn't actually been true. They haven't changed, and the treaties have gone swimming through. And therefore, I'm afraid I wouldn't trust them if at this very late stage, after we voted to leave, they said, lo and behold, now we've decided to reform. It wouldn't be a very credible approach for them to take.
Just a quick word on what happened yesterday, Michel Barnier's draft legal document. Some people are saying that this is an attempt to annex Northern Ireland. It's also an attempt, bearing in mind that Keir Starmer was in Brussels yesterday, it's also, and Jeremy Corbyn's change in policy on the customs union, it's also an attempt to topple the democratically elected government of this country. Do you have any truck with those views?
Well, I agree with the latter point. I was speaking to a number of my friends in the DUP yesterday, and they were making it absolutely clear to me that what is being proposed would break up the confidence and supply agreement. It would be in contradiction of it, and therefore the Prime Minister would fall. I think for a foreign organisation to set out terms of a deal that would bring down the government with which it is negotiating in bad faith.
Do you think people like Tony Blair and John Major have more affinity with the EU than they do their own country in some ways?
Well, I listened to the podcast Mr. Blair did with the BBC, where he said that he would quite have liked to have had Mr. Tusk's job. So you have to understand that the way he is pointed is towards the EU rather than towards what the British people voted for. And John Major's experience is very coloured by his period in office when he had to deal with all the difficulties of Maastricht and, to my mind, his failures there and his failure with the ERM, which did such damage to the British economy, destroyed so many British businesses, and that's his legacy, and he is understandably preoccupied with the mistakes he made in the past.
You have been very critical of John Major over the last 24 hours. I could read out some of your comments. You said he's full of humbug on the issue. That was one of the more mild comments.
Well, should I come to the humbug issue? Because
Go on, then.
He said it should be a free vote. When he was Prime Minister, members of Parliament were bullied, were shouted at, were pushed physically. 4-letter words were shouted at them to get them to support the government. And that was for the Maastricht Treaty, which was the most integrated treaty.
And the wit behind that was, of course, David Davis. Irony of ironies.
Well, we don't need to go into all the details, but the person responsible, the man with whom the buck stopped, was one John Major. And for him to say...
So David Davis was only obeying orders.
Yeah, indeed. But for him to say it should be a free vote is complete humbug, and forgets how he behaved. And also his speech is full of Majorisms. He says words to the effect of, "I don't want to cause any trouble," when he knows he's causing maximum trouble and inconvenience to the Prime Minister. And it's that sort of obvious political legerdemain that I think one should be suspicious of.
I don't know if you saw it, you probably didn't, but I teased you on Twitter this morning and said, did you not remember Ronald Reagan's maxim, never speak ill of a fellow Conservative?
Oh, is he a Conservative? I'm so sorry, I was missing that.
Jacob, thank you very much. That's Jacob Rees-Mogg there.